Our topic this afternoon is God's amazing providence, and we'll be considering Paul's encounter in Jerusalem. We'll consider God's providence on him, on his life, and last week we paused at chapter 23, verse 11. You'll recall that Paul was almost torn into parts in the council, and the centurion saved his life. And that evening, the Lord revealed himself to Paul in verse 11. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer, Paul." Well, last week we mentioned that there was a comfort from God to Paul. God said to Paul, "I'm by your side, be of good cheer." Paul indeed needed comfort. If you were Paul, you may be dismayed. Or he may even be in despair. He's not understood by his church. And apart from speaking to the elders and James, he didn't have any opportunity to speak to anyone in church. And then in the temple, he's beaten. And then halfway through his speech, when he said that he's sent by God to the Gentiles, there was this riot. And then in the council, after Paul spoke a few words, spoke for a while, and then there was rioting again. So now Paul is imprisoned. Maybe he's despair. He's dejected probably. He wanted to go to Rome, but God led him to Jerusalem to bring forth donations to the churches in Jerusalem. He just wanted to stop by Jerusalem briefly before he set off to Rome. But now he's imprisoned, and he saw no hope to be in Rome. And he had doubts about the things he did, about his encounter in Jerusalem. He had doubts as to whether God still approved what he was doing, and whether he's still blessed by God. When we encounter these challenges or these setbacks, we may have doubts. But Jesus Christ at that time stood by him and said, "Be of good cheer." God reminded him that God approved what he was doing. So be of good cheer. Or in some translation, it's translated as "take good courage. For as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem." So it's approved by Jesus Christ. Okay. What was Paul doing in Jerusalem? He was testifying of Jesus Christ. So he testified for Jesus Christ. So must thou bear witness also at Rome. So Jesus Christ knew what Paul was thinking. Jesus Christ knew that Paul wanted to go to Rome to testify Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ told him, "So must thou bear witness also at Rome." And then from here to the end of Acts, we see that Paul, even though he came across a lot of challenges on his journey to Rome. Now for example, he's imprisoned, and then he came across a peril at the sea, and then all that didn't stop Paul from going to Rome, because he knew that God had promised him, "So must thou bear witness also at Rome." So this is comforting for Paul. God directed Paul, his path. So we are going to focus today on a few things. First, somebody wanted to kill Paul. There's this plan to assassinate Paul. And then we're going to look at Paul's trial or Paul's defense before Felix. And then we're going to look at Paul's encounter in Caesarea. So the first part, in verse 12, and when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. So these are referred to as the zealous. Okay, they were very zealous Jews, and they beat up Paul 2 days ago in the temple, and they wanted to kill Paul. They wanted to get rid of Paul, for they considered Paul blaspheming God. So they were finding an opportunity to assassinate Paul. So it's a group of 40 plus. Okay, it's a group of 40 plus here. They sworn. And in the original text, it means it's a curse. In other words, they said, if we don't kill Paul, we get cursed. If you don't kill Paul, they would neither eat nor drink, so they would die. So if you don't eat or drink, you would naturally die. So it's a bad curse. And this time, they had every intention to kill Paul. And think about it. They were very determined. They were prepared to make sacrifices in order to accomplish this plan to kill Paul. They, even though they may have convinced the centurion to take Paul to the council, there might be a few soldiers in the council, and there were 40 of them, more than 40 of them. And on the way, they wanted to kill Paul, so there were bound to be confrontations, and the soldiers would fight against them. And this group of people were prepared to die for their cause, to kill Paul. So these were fanatics. And the plan was simple, that is to get a centurion to take Paul to the council. That was some distance away from the fortress of Antonia. And on the way up there, they would not, deploy maybe a few hundred soldiers to escort Paul there, Maybe there were only a few soldiers escorting Paul. And these people, this group of zealots, they tried, in their plan, they wanted to assassinate Paul on Paul's journey to the fortress of Antonia. So they met with the chief priest and elders. They came to the chief priest and elders. Those people were the Sadducees. They must have hated Paul because Paul talked about resurrection. It caused the Sadducees didn't like it. In verse 15, that they bring him down unto you tomorrow, as though you would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we, or ever he come near, are ready to kill him. So Paul here was helpless. He didn't know anything. He's imprisoned and he's bound. And it seems as though the churches in Jerusalem didn't try to help him or to take care of him and to try to release him. But we give thanks to God because God's providence is so amazing. When Paul was helpless, this plan was leaked in verse 16. And when Well, God's providence caused this plan to fail. And when Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. So God's providence is truly wonderful. God's way of doing things is often wonderful. God often not employs, in this case, God didn't employ, a disciple or a member of a church to help. But God employs a young man. I believe that, he may be a teenager. Why? Because the centurion, in verse 19, then the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him aside privately. A chief captain here. If you're somebody of 20, 30 years old, he would not be holding your hand. So we trust that he's a teenager, so that you would take him by the hand. We know that he's the nephew of Paul. Okay, the son of Paul's sisters. His name is not even recorded in the Bible. We don't know what he's doing in Jerusalem. And subsequently, there is no mention of this person in the Bible. God often, in his providence, in his plan, employs very insignificant people to accomplish his plan. So God's providence is wonderful. It's just like, we read about Naaman earlier. How come Naaman knew of Elisha? How come knew that, somebody could heal his leprosy? It's because of a young lady the Jewish maid told her. We don't even know the name of this Jewish maid. We don't even know her background. So God's providence is wonderful. He uses insignificant people or insignificant means to do his work. So anyway, this person met Paul, in verse 20, and he said, the Jews have agreed to Caesarea that thou wouldst bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. But do not thou yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath. We don't know. Well, in verse 22, so the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him, see thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me. So that was dealt with seriously by the chief priest. God caused his heart to have some serious consideration. At that time, the political environment, the political climate was such that the Jews were against Rome. And there's this Egyptian that caused trouble, taking the Jews out of the city, trying to get rid of the Rome, and the Roman soldiers killed a lot and arrested a lot, and there was a lot of shed blood. So it was a time of instability. So this chief priest knew that if Paul continued to stay there, there would only be troubles, and it may not be safe for Paul. So there was already 2 rioting, one by the crowd and one in the council, and if that went on, we don't know how many riotings there would be. So the chief captain knew that he had to deal seriously with this. So he told the son of Paul's sisters to leave. So we know that even the heart of the chief captain is in the hands of God. God caused him to realize the seriousness of the situation and to evaluate that things would go wrong if it continued that way. We don't know whether this chief priest was sympathetic to Paul or whether he was afraid, but maybe both. But he decided to send Paul to Caesarea. So in verse 22, in verse 23, and he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, Make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200, at the 3rd hour of the night. Oh, God's providence. One commentator said, God's resources are greater than the devil's resources. There were only 30 murderers in quest of Paul's life, but God raised nearly 500 brave soldiers to protect him. So more are they that are for us than they are against us. So he's probably referring to 2 Kings chapter 6. Maybe you could turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 12 to verse 17. The king of Syria was not happy with Elijah, and his plan was kind of destroyed by Elijah. In verse 14, therefore sent he thither horses and chariots and a great host, and they came by night and compassed the city about. So in 2 Kings, we note of a lot of events like this. Look at verse 12. And one of his servants said, None, my lord, O king, but Elijah. The meaning here is, Elijah was there to help. And then, go and have a look to see where he is. And he said, Go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told him, saying, Behold, he is stolen. In verse 15, and when the servant of the man of God was risen early and gone forth, behold, an host compassed the city, both of horses and chariots. So many, chariots and horses just to take one person, Elijah. And his servant said unto him, Alas, my master, how shall we do? And he answered, Fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. This is God's wonderful providence. So Elisha prayed in verse 17, and Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes, that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. So we need not fear the providence of God. Paul was on his own. 40 people wanted to kill him, wanted to assassinate him. But we thank God. God prepared the very best Roman soldiers, 70 of them, to take Paul to Caesarea. So, they left Jerusalem at night. And in verse 32, in Acts chapter 23, verse 24, and provide them beasts that they may set Paul on, and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. When you're a prisoner, the soldiers, you often need to walk as well if you're a prisoner, But because it was a matter of urgency, and the the soldiers were fit, they could walk quickly, they could run quickly. But if Paul was too slow, then, things wouldn't work out. So the chief priest prepared for Paul beast, and for Paul to set on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. Well, God's providence was so wonderful. Paul was beaten up, and he was about to die. If he had to walk, some 60 miles, that would be more than 10 hours walk. And Paul wouldn't be strong enough to do that. So God's providence is wonderful. God would provide for us. And then this chief priest wrote a letter to Felix, the governor, and said, this letter is quite interesting. This letter is practical, but there are two things that are interesting here. First, verse 27. This man was taken of the Jews, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. That was wrong. At that time he didn't know he was a Roman. He saw somebody was beaten up, and then he sent forth an army to rescue him. And after Paul gave his speech the second time, when there was another rioting, then he said, I will take Paul, and and according to the Bible, he examined Paul under scourging, and at that time only he found out he is a Roman. So the first time when he rescued Paul, he didn't know he's a Roman. So, the people of this world are like that. So men are like that. When people, we only look after our own interest. He didn't even say that. He only found out he's a Roman after he examined him under scourging. But in this letter, he also mentioned that he felt that the arguments between Paul and the Jews were only of a religious nature, whom are perceived to be accused of questions of the law, but to have nothing laid to the charge worthy of death or of bonds. So he knew. So he wanted Felix to know that it's right to get Paul there, because Paul was in danger in Jerusalem. Even if they released Paul in Jerusalem, Paul would have died soon after that. And he wanted Felix to make inquiry and to settle this matter. And then the army went with Paul to Antipatris and Antipatris, and that was 35 miles away from Jerusalem. And there was a city built by Herod to remember his father. It's a fertile city. It's on a plain field, and it's a fertile plain land, and from there to Rome is an easy journey. And with God's providence, Paul reached Felix safely, and Paul was delivered safely into the hand of Felix, and then he was detained in the palace built by Herod the Great, and now served as the Roman governor headquarters. Now it's used by the Lord as a safe place for his servant Paul. Now in Acts chapter 24, there's this advocate that is a lawyer, so he's great at advocacy. He's very skillful in flattering Felix. He accused Paul of three charges. First, sedation. In verse 5, for instigating raisins of the Jews all over the emperor. And then there's this heresy. Is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes in also verse 5. And then the third charge in verse 6, he profaned the temple, is a charge amongst the Jews punishable by death. So Paul defended for himself, and he said, in verse 10, then Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been of many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. He said, I only went to Jerusalem for 12 days. Until today, in verse 11, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. 12 days minus 5 days, for the journey, and minus the days when Paul was kept, minus the 2 or 3 days when Paul was kept in the fortress of in the fortress of Antonia. He was only, after subtracting all those days, we know that Paul was only in Jerusalem for like roughly 3 days. He said, how can I cause so much trouble in just 3 days? He said he never gathered the crowd. He never argued or debated in the city or in the temple. No. He only went to the temple, for some rituals. And then he's accused of profaning the temple. So, his accusers were not present. If they found Paul problematic, they could have come up to make their accusations against Paul clear. But there is no witness to all these accusations, so it follows that all these accusations were false. And then he spoke to Felix. He said the God whom he worshipped was the same as the God whom the Jews worshipped, and the God he worshipped, and the worship was also made in accordance with the law and the prophets. in verse 14. So what I believe in, my faith, is that if the Jews truly believed in God, if the Jews truly believed in the laws and the prophets, they should also believe in Jesus Christ. They should also become Christians. So Paul explained this in detail. And he only did in verse 22. And when Philip heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, When Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter. So Philip's been there for 5 years, and his wife is also a Jew. So Philip knew all these things. Philip actually had all the evidence to release Paul, but he didn't do that. He said he had to wait till the chief captain, Lysias, come down. Philip could have asked him to come down immediately. Paul was kept for 2 years. But Philip didn't release Paul. On what basis? And on the basis that, number one, he wanted money. Philip, according to history, is a cruel man, is a cruel governor. So the Jews didn't like him, and he's a corrupt man. He's driven by greed. So he wanted to please the Jews. So the Jews hated Paul, and Philip wanted to please the Jews, so he didn't deal with Paul immediately. In verse 26 and 27, he hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul, that he might lose him. Wherefore he sent for him Theophilus, and communed with him. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Philip's room, and Philip, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. That's why Paul is still bound. Paul is not released. Paul didn't have a fair trial before Felix. Felix didn't want to offend the Jews, and at the same time, he can't find any ways to find Paul guilty. So the third part of our subject today, after 2 years, Felix kept Paul for 2 years in custody. So let's think about it. So you talk about the providence of God. Some people might ask, why would God allow Felix to keep Paul for such a long period of time, 2 years? How come God didn't intervene? How come God didn't find a way to release Paul? These are reasonable questions, okay, and we have to address them. But I don't have an answer. Because let us not forget, God's providence is mysterious. Very often we don't know the reason behind God's plan. So it's not possible for us to know all the mysteries of God's providence. Okay, but from this account, we observe 3 things that are worth considering. Number one, the few years before Paul was kept in custody, he was laboring very hard. It was a missionary journey after missionary journey. He traveled to many places. He worked day and night. He preached in the day and did other various things during the day, and then at night he made tents to make him a living. He labored very hard. He faced a lot of stress and strain and burden. He's restless, and he also came across a lot of instability. There were riotings in Ephesus, and he was often the subject of attack. People wanted to assassinate Paul. So this servant of God encountered a long period of tireless activities, stress and strain. Maybe God wanted to allow Paul some rest during these 2 years. We often say, we need a sabbatical. Well, Paul needed such time to equip himself. Maybe God was using this time to equip Paul to further do his work in Rome. In Rome, we know that Paul was also in bondage. Maybe that was to prepare. Maybe, Paul didn't do a lot of work in Caesarea. Paul took the opportunity to rest. Well, if you look at it from this perspective, then God's providence is often for the good of his children, of his servants. Paul truly needed rest. I'm sure he's tired, he's fatigued. God, Jesus Christ appeared to him, and that means that Paul truly needed comfort. And these 2 years shouldn't be too hard for Paul. Why? Because look at Felix in verse 23. Look at Felix. And he commanded a centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and that he should forbid none of his acquaintance to minister or come unto him. He gave Paul a lot of room and liberty. Paul was a Roman citizen, and he's not found guilty, so he has some privileges or some rights. And this Felix wanted to be good to Paul because Felix wanted money from Paul. So during this period, even though Paul was not able to go around and about, during these 2 periods, he didn't have to labor hard. Okay. God was gracious to Paul. God allowed people to provide for him. You might say, who would provide for Paul in Caesarea? Well, number one, it would be Philip. And maybe the church there also provided for Paul and visited him. And some commentators say even Luke and Aristarchus, these 2 men, also went with Paul to Jerusalem. Aristarchus was a man from the Thessalonica church. And then if we read further on in Acts chapter 27, these 2 people also followed Paul to Rome. And entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. So you must say, this person is not from Jerusalem, is not from Caesarea. How come this man suddenly appeared in Caesarea? Some commentators are of the view that he had all along been following Paul, helping Paul. It's only a speculation, but I think it's quite probable. So Paul was looked after by somebody during this time. So Paul was equipping Paul, giving him a time of rest. So even though Paul didn't have a chance to witness to many, he had the opportunity to witness to the very influential and officials of high rank. For example, Felix and Drusilla. Drusilla was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, which is the one who killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. Okay? If you read Acts chapter 12, the daughter, okay, of Herod who killed James, who persecuted the church. And then when Felix was about to retire, and then this Festus Porcius Festus also came in, and Paul also witnessed to him. And then there was this in chapter 25 verse 13. And after certain days came Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. And so Paul had the opportunity to witness to Agrippa. And Bernice, the younger sister. So Herod, Herod was the one who persecuted Christians. His son, Antiparis, also persecuted Christians, but their sons had the opportunity to listen to the gospel. In verse 23, chapter 25, verse 23. And on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with a great pomp, was entered into the palace of hearing, with the chief captains, and principal men of the city, at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. So this time, God used him to speak to the leaders of Rome and the VIPs. Okay, so Paul also did God's work here. So God's providence is amazing and wonderful. We know of the life of Joseph, God's providence on Joseph when he was in Egypt, and now we clearly see the providence of God on Paul. So may God help us. So what's the application here? Do you believe in God's providence? Do you believe in His providence? Do you believe that God is in control of all things? Do you live your life as though you understand God's providence? You believe in God's providence, but it doesn't mean that you walk in accordance with this truth. If you believe in God's providence, you should be a Christian of prayer, because you believe that God has power to cause all things to happen in accordance with His will. And we also believe that God's will also includes our prayer. We believe that God hears and answers prayer, and He will provide. So we should be people of prayer. Of course, we also have to do what we should do, but prayer is important. And then, in adversity or in all situations, we should be patient. Well, look at Paul. 2 years in Caesarea. If he didn't believe in God's providence, he would be very disturbed. But he understands that it's God's arrangement, and he knows that one day he will be in Rome. He knows that God will allow him to go to Rome, and he waited upon God's timing. He wouldn't be anxious. Okay, and then, so we should be patient in adversity. This patience is a fruit of the Holy Spirit. And he should be a thankful person. If we believe in God, especially in prosperity, we should be thankful. We should be content. And if you believe in God's providence, we'll have trust in God for the unknown future. Our future may not be bright. Look at the world today. It's like the world is getting worse. We face a lot of uncertainties and unknowns. If we believe in God's providence, we should be we should have faith in the future. For the future. It's like Romans 8:28. All things work together for the good to those who love God. And nothing can separate us from God's love. So this is a man of faith. This is a man who trusts in the providence of God. But if you're anxious, if you're disturbed, you ask yourself, do you believe in the providence of God? If you, yes, even though we may face a very unknown future, a dark future, we would put our trust entirely on God, and we would be positive like Paul. We will only look forward. We believe that all things would work out good, would be for the good of us. If we are constantly anxious and worried, then may God help you to know His providence and to prove His providence, so that we will have peace beyond our understanding and comprehension. Let's pray.